So there are enslaved African Americans living there. And I even found out that the schoolmaster was actually paying the teachers to teach some of these African Americans after hours. So this is a really kind of rich and diverse place to look at a new view of this period of American history, you know, kind of the Jacksonian era and also the era of removal, to look at, you know, how people are trying to navigate this era of change. So it's a rich topic and there's a lot to talk about. So I'm eager to hear all of your questions.
Yes, definitely comes across in the book. So what is the history of Choctaw Academy? Why was it established? What were some of its goals?
Sure. So this was, unlike some of the later boarding schools, this was actually a collaborative project between the United States and initially the Choctaw Nation, although many other Indian nations eventually sent students there. So I would say that the US and Indian nations definitely had different motivations for why they were interested in education. So on the part of the US, it will probably not surprise us to learn that one of the motivations is kind of assimilation, you know, to familiarize Native youths. And this was only a school for boys and men, I should mention at the outset. So there are no girls or women who come to the school. And one of the things the US thought was that by educating these Native boys and men, that they would gain allies who might help push US policy in Indian nations. You know, they thought they would gain these allies in Indian country. And so I think probably the more interesting question is, why were Native nations interested in it? Because they did contract with the federal government to send students to the school, and they paid for most of it. So Native nations actually paid for over 90% of the money that was used to run the school. So at that time, like the school started in 1825, and a lot of Native people were interested in Western education. Of course, they had their own methods of education, their own ways of kind of understanding and passing on skills to future generations. But there was not a lot of opportunity for Western schooling in Indian nations at that time. Basically, the only opportunities were through missionary schools. And, you know, some people felt very comfortable sending their children to missionary schools, but others really did not like the fact that missionaries often pushed conversion over education. Choctaw parents really wanted the education to come first. So there were a lot of kind of complaints and tension between missionaries and certain tribal leaders. And so I would say that more than any other figure, the person who was the most interested in creating some kind of alternative to mission schools was Mashulatabi. And he really resented the power of missionaries, was not interested in Christian conversion. And he also wanted Indian men to be able to gain a kind of higher level of education. So basically, the only mission education was more of basic skills, reading, writing, arithmetic. And what Mashulatabi and actually a lot of other Native leaders wanted was people who were really fluent in English, fluent enough to be able to, for example, translate treaties or negotiate trade deals or become lawyers. You know, like think of all the treaties that Native people are signing at this time. So they don't really want to rely on white lawyers and translators to deal with these issues. They really want to produce their own class of, you know, again, professional leaders, business people, politicians. So that's what draws a lot of Native leaders to the academy. And so it's called Choctaw Academy because obviously the Choctaws were the first to become involved with it. But eventually there are 17 different Native nations represented there, and over 600 students attend the school throughout the course of its lifetime. So the school lasts from 1825 to 1848. And they're really culturally different people represented there. So there are other Native people from the South. There are Seminoles, Creeks, Cherokees, but also a lot of people from the upper Midwest. So the second largest group besides the Choctaws are the Potawatomis. So there are quite a few Potawatomis, Ojibways, even some people from the Dakotas, and the Osage from the Great Plains. So it's, again, kind of drawing people from across Eastern North America.
All right, excellent. So what were some of the kinds of things that Choctaw Academy students learned? Can you tell us a little bit more about this intellectual culture that you discuss in the book?
Sure, yeah. So, um, like the concept of the academy is a little bit different from our educational system today. So, an academy was thought of as being a kind of a a place where someone could learn kind of basic Western skills like reading, writing, arithmetic, but could also serve as preparation for college, or even the end point of a person's education. So it had like this kind of wide swath of different subjects. And and at Choctaw Academy, there are basically three different levels of education. So first, for the beginners, you had spelling, reading, and writing. And the only official language of instruction was English. So that was a huge stumbling block. I mean, those who really excelled at Choctaw Academy either came from bilingual families, so they had spoken English growing up, or they were really young and were able to kind of learn that second language more easily. But for some people, they really struggled with these English language skills. Eventually, the academy did hire some native teachers, and so I don't know for sure, but I assume that they were able to help with some translation issues and so forth. But in any case, the beginners class was always the biggest class at Choctaw Academy. And in terms of like ages, the youngest boys that I found who went to the school were 6, but there were also like men of 20 in there. And if the 20-year-old came in and didn't know any English, he would be sitting in the classroom next to the 6-year-old. So it was really just totally divided by skill level and not by age. So that would strike us as really strange today, but it was very normal in other American academies. So the second level of education was the intermediate level. And so that would focus on things like advanced English grammar, geography, history, surveying. So, kind of measuring land, right? Obviously a valuable skill, and algebra. And then the most advanced students would take pretty advanced courses that would be like college level preparation courses, like moral philosophy, astronomy, Latin, and classical history. And that curriculum overall was really similar to white academies at the time. And I should mention, like, as a final kind of option, some of the students who completed the curriculum and did really well became teachers at the academy later. And some of them also went on to either college or a professional school. So Peter Pitchlynn, for example, who we can talk more about later, he was a graduate who went on to the University of Nashville, which is now Vanderbilt University. And then there was a college that was very near to Choctaw Academy. So Choctaw Academy is close to Lexington, Kentucky. And the big university in Lexington at the time was called Transylvania University. And so some of the native students went to law and medical school at Transylvania. So, what you can kind of see here is that Choctaw Academy is a community of scholars, but also of intellectuals. And so what I mean by that is that they created intellectual products. So they had debating societies at the school, for example. Many of them composed poems or journals. They gave speeches. Some of them wrote letters to Congress. Some of them later started newspapers in Indian Territory or wrote constitutions or gave speeches. So you can start to see this kind of network forming at Choctaw Academy, and then it extends outward after these students graduate.
And so you mentioned Peter Pitchlynn, and you really kind of capture the whole length, give us a life story of Pitchlynn in a lot of senses, and his experience at Choctaw Academy and how that kind of shaped his career. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you've written about his life and the various roles that he took on after he graduated from Choctaw Academy and came back and then did all these other things?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Peter Pitchlynn really is the most important person in this story in most ways, and he's a fascinating individual as well, right? So he's born in 1806 into a pretty prominent family. He's the son of John Pitchlynn and Sophia, whose maiden name was Folsom. His maternal uncle was Meshulatubby, and so by the kind of laws of matrilineal inheritance, I mean Meshulatubby has sons, but he really looks on Peter as his successor in a lot of ways, and I think part of that is probably because of matrilineality, but I think part of it too is probably that Peter Pitchlynn shows a real interest in politics and the kind of proficiency at speaking and things like that. So he said, and Peter Pitchlynn is a really prolific writer, and there are lots of his papers. Megan's shaking her head, so there's lots of papers that are preserved of his at the Oklahoma Historical Society, but even more at the Gilcrease. And I know that there's a project right now that I'd love to learn more about of digitizing his papers, but he has thousands and thousands of documents at the Gilcrease. And he also kept a journal, so we have just a really rich and compelling view of the complexity of Peter Pitchlynn and all the different things that he was involved with. But in one case, he reflects on like why he became interested in intellectual culture. And he said it was because Meshulatubby let him watch a council meeting from afar. And so he was just really impressed with kind of the eloquence and the rhetorical skills of these Choctaw leaders. And that's why he first became interested in becoming a leader and acquiring a kind of vast range of education. So he goes to some mission schools as a youth, and then he goes to Choctaw Academy, and he's actually older by that point. I think he's in his late teens or 20. So he goes to Choctaw Academy. He's there with his brother Silas and some other relatives. He has some concerns about it from the beginning. So he is one of the first students there, and Choctaw tribal members tend to think that the quality of education was better in the earlier period there than it was later. But even in that early period, Peter Pitchlynn has some concerns about it, which he writes about to the tribal council. So those concerns are things like the curriculum, it's not as advanced as he wants it to be. And at that time, for example, there was no Latin teacher. And to kind of go to law school like Peter Pitchlynn wanted to do, you kind of had to learn Latin in that period, He's also concerned about some of the material conditions. So like Pitchlynn comes from a wealthy family, the students who go to Choctaw Academy, especially in the early period, tend to be the sons or nephews of chiefs, and a lot of their families are or in the fur trade, or they own plantations. So these are wealthy people by any standards, and they want to be treated that way at school. And so Pitchlynn in particular feels like he's not being, his status is not being appreciated. He wants to be treated as the equal to whites, and he doesn't feel that people are quite meeting that standard. So that's a concern for him from the beginning. So eventually he leaves Choctaw Academy and goes to college in Nashville, and then he returns back to Choctaw Nation. He leads a group during removal. He becomes involved in Choctaw Nation politics. And probably his first major political role is as superintendent of schools in Indian Territory. And so that is an extremely important tribal office at the time because education is a major concern for the Choctaws and for several other tribal nations. So people, they're really struggling in the aftermath of removal, but a lot of people think that education is the key to kind of maintaining the nation moving forward. And so as superintendent of Choctaw schools, he actually decides it would be best to close Choctaw Academy. And this is in the early 1840s. And what he wants to do is establish a public system of schools in Indian Territory, in the Choctaw Nation. And we can talk more about the mechanics of that, but it's really, he's, I would say, is one of the leaders of tribally controlled education in Indian Territory. He becomes chief during the Civil War era, so that's probably the thing he's most famous for. And for a lot of his career, he's also a diplomat in Washington, D.C. So when the Choctaws signed their removal treaty, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, one of the things that they wanted was to have a representative in Congress, to have a delegate in Congress. And that treaty was actually, or that article of the treaty was agreed to by the treaty commissioners who came down to the Choctaw Nation to negotiate that. But the Senate refused to ratify that article. So they ratified the whole treaty, but they took out that article. And that was something that the Choctaws really protested, over the course of the next several decades, that they really wanted that representation in Congress. And so even though that article was removed from the treaty, Pitchlynn said, well, I'm just going to be a diplomat. I'm going to go to DC and represent the interests of my nation. And so he undertook this role as kind of a lobbyist and a petitioner to Congress to just represent issues relevant to the Choctaw Nation and also to other Indian nations at Congress. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying, I think, Pitchlynn's a really rich and fascinating figure. One of the interesting things that happened when, through the course of researching this book, was that I found out he had met Charles Dickens, the famous English novelist. So Dickens in the early 1840s was traveling through the US, writing this kind of travelogue called American Notes. And he writes about meeting Pitchlynn, and he really had a crush on Peter Pitchlynn. There's no other way to put it. He was really gushing over him. So if you're interested in kind of checking that out, I would tell you to go just look at his Dickens book, American Notes. So the two of them discuss literature, museums. Peter Pitchlynn gave him a lithograph imprint of himself, which was like a really high quality printing technology of the time. And Dickens kept it and treasured it. And Peter Pitchlynn said, well, you should come to Indian Territory and meet Choctaws, and we can go on a buffalo hunt. And, he was really trying to enlist Dickens to represent Choctaw issues on a global scale, And I think that interaction helps us understand Pitchlynn a little bit better because, he's really politically savvy. He learns how to move in the same circles as elite whites, but he represents the Choctaw people. And in terms of his experiences with Choctaw Academy, he learns the mistakes of Choctaw Academy, and he wants to do something different in Indian Territory.
Okay, good. And so Peter Pitchlynn, obviously the most famous, but who were some other people? Sandra in the comments mentioned she wants to hear more about James Mcdonald. So can you tell us a little bit more about other people?
Sure. James Mcdonald is another really fascinating person that I loved learning about in the course of this project. So James L. Mcdonald, he didn't actually attend Choctaw Academy, but he was pretty instrumental in the founding of Choctaw Academy. So he grew up in Old Choctaw Nation, and he grew up with his mother. His father was absent, so his mother's name was Molly. And she was really keen on having him educated in Western schools. And he went to actually not a mission school, but a white school in Mississippi. Um, and later on, he was this incredibly brilliant student, and Molly pushed to have him attend private schools in the United States. So he went to DC. He eventually became the ward of Thomas McKinney, who at that time was the head of the Office of Indian Affairs, and went to private academies in Georgetown, DC, and he even studied with John McLean, who later became a member of the Supreme Court. So he was this incredibly accomplished Choctaw scholar, and he became a really effective translator and negotiator for the Choctaw Nation. And I think that that is part of what inspired other Choctaws to seek out education, because they saw how effective McDonald was in matters of business and diplomacy. And so, James L. McDonald helps negotiate the Treaty of 1825, which is what sets aside an educational annuity for Choctaw Academy. And he also visits the academy a couple times to inspect it, because he wants to see what's happening. He doesn't totally trust the white politicians who are involved with it. So he, when the removal fight kind of heats up in the late 1820s, when Mississippi is trying to usurp Choctaw treaty rights and squatters are starting to move into the Choctaw Nation, James L. McDonald moves back to Choctaw Nation to try to help in the fight. And he has this incredibly kind of sad story, because eventually it looks like he takes his own life because of the kind of struggle of removal and just how devastating it is to him personally. But in terms of like his overall life, he's an incredibly important intellectual figure, and also the first accredited Native American lawyer. So the first lawyer who is Native, who we know of, who passed the bar exam. In terms of like other famous people, there are so many actually who attend Choctaw Academy. So Robert M. Jones, who's a planter, he's a delegate to the Confederate Congress and president of the United Nations of Indian Territory. He's a really important figure during the Civil War. And then several people who go on to become chief or a high-ranking leader of the Choctaw Nation. So George Harkins, Peter Pitchlynn, Samuel Garland, Alfred Wade, William Bryant, who becomes Supreme Court Justice. In terms, and even like, I think one of the most interesting things about Choctaw Academy, and you have these really famous people who go to school there, but also a whole class of doctors and lawyers and teachers who become really instrumental in rebuilding society in Indian Territory. So there's one man named Adam Nail who goes to Choctaw Academy and becomes a physician. And then he goes to Indian Territory, and his sons and his grandchildren also become physicians. So he kind of, inspires these future generations. There are famous people from other tribes who go to Choctaw Academy. Maybe the most famous of the other non-Choctaws is Lewis Downing, who becomes chief of the Cherokee Nation after the Civil War and helps kind of heal some of the divides there. There's also an Anishinaabe student who becomes a teacher at Choctaw Academy, and he becomes instrumental in instituting bicultural and bilingual education among Anishinaabes. So just, dozens and dozens of really fascinating people.
Yes. Sandra dropped this in the comments. She says, Assistant Chief Jack Austin Jr. is a direct descendant of student Samuel Austin. So,
oh, wow.
Yes. Small world.
It's continuing to inspire the generations then.
Exactly. We're still learning from these ancestors who paved the way for us. So, okay. So one of the really strong kind of points in the book for me as I was reading it was your investigation of the life and family of Richard Mentor Johnson, who managed and ran Choctaw Academy. Through your examination of his personal finances, the financial records of the school, and his work as a Kentucky congressman, you kind of really expose how Johnson profited off of Choctaw Academy to pay for his own massive debts. Despite the distance between Choctaw Academy and Indian Territory, as well as to the northern indigenous nations, it really shows us how Indian nations, like Choctaw Nation's treaty annuities and their annual allocations, were going into the pockets of Johnson and his like circle of businessmen. So could you say a little bit more about Johnson and his story and his kind of motivation?
Sure, yeah. So Richard Mentor Johnson is basically a lifelong Kentucky politician, and he was really famous. He was basically in the Democratic Party, probably the second most famous person, with Andrew Jackson being the first, right? So he's a member of Jackson's party. And he's initially becomes a politician after he claimed to have killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames. So he has this whole career that's just intimately tied to Indigenous people, right? And kind of trying to use Indigenous issues to enhance his own fortunes, which is not very unusual for politicians of the day, right? Like a lot of American politicians were trying to make money off of Indian affairs. And when it comes to Johnson in particular, he was a planter, and planters were often like just perpetually operating in debt. You know, we think of them as these really wealthy people, but they're constantly borrowing money and buying goods on credit. And it seems like Johnson was especially bad at managing that. He was like, his financial records are largely at the Library of Congress, and they're just a mess. He also made a series of bad investments. So his probably most famous blunder was, and again, this involves Indian affairs, is that he and one of his brothers got awarded a federal contract to create a series of trading forts along the Yellowstone River. You know, so the U.S. is kind of pushing west and trying to engage Western peoples through trade, and these were going to be kind of a combination of trading posts and Indian affairs outposts, right? So anyway, the boats never make it to the Yellowstone River. All the trade goods are lost, and this puts him out of millions of dollars. So he basically never recovers from this, and just has lifelong financial problems. So he really seizes on the idea of Indian education, and from the beginning, he's out to make money. I mean, he thinks that it'll be a really good PR move for his political career, right? Because it's kind of in line with the policy of the US. He also has two daughters with an enslaved African American woman, and he wants those daughters to get an education. And at the time in antebellum Kentucky, it's very hard for them to access education. So he is interested in having a school on his property that could facilitate that. And then finally, he wants to make money off of the academy. And initially, he thinks he can do that through just things like boarding, you know, providing boarding and some of the tuition. And, you know, other people in DC are aware of that. But he kind of goes beyond this. So he starts to just skim money. And remember that if we're talking about him getting money off of boarding costs and so forth, most of the people who are doing the day-to-day work at Choctaw Academy, like cooking the food and cleaning the rooms and so forth, are slaves who are getting paid nothing. And he also doesn't buy any additional enslaved people to help out with this work. So he is essentially just forcing enslaved people to do more work, right? So it's not as though he's really actually investing a lot. And so even from the really early days of the academy, I mean, there are letters where he just documents this, that he says, I'm going to pay X amount of money from the Choctaw annuity to the teacher so that he can instruct my daughters and their cousins in his off time. So that's, it's beginning from the very beginning, but it does, the financial graft becomes worse after removal. So the Indian Removal Act passes in 1830, and it really turned the theft of indigenous resources into a national policy. It becomes, national policy is really about taking of indigenous land and other kinds of resources. So in this case, capital, capital investments that people were promised through treaties. And so there's not very much oversight of what's happening at Choctaw Academy. So basically, if we wanted to look at a long story of it, it would be a story of things getting worse and worse over time, with a kind of marked decline after Indian removal. And so what gets worse? Well, the food gets worse, the clothing gets worse, the dorms. The instructors are largely the same until the 1840s. The quality of instruction probably does get worse, but especially in the 1840s, it gets worse. Sometimes students are so hungry that they steal neighbors' hogs. We're starting to see the academy go from something that Indian nations are partnering with the federal government on to something that they're losing control of. That even if their resources are paying for the education that is being dispensed at Choctaw Academy, they themselves feel like they're losing control of it. And part of the problem is that when Native nations are signing contracts to send a certain amount of students to the academy per year and then paying the tuition and board for them, but they're locked into multi-year contracts. And that really becomes the problem. So if they refuse to send new students, then Richard Mentor Johnson would sometimes keep students who should have already graduated so that he could just keep charging these tuition fees, And so the nations and Johnson become locked in this kind of battle. Some students are there a long time after their terms expire. Some people are there for they should have been there for 4 years, but they stay there for 8 years. There's an increasing number of runaways. Students engage in certain things like they burn down a building at one point. So they're, engaging in certain kinds of activism or even kind of disobedience. Peter Pitchlynn, I mentioned earlier that he gets this idea in 1841 that Choctaw Academy should close, that things have just gone too far. And it's one of the reasons why things had gone on so long at Choctaw Academy is that Johnson is a really high-ranking federal officer. So he's an important congressman, and then he becomes vice president under Martin Van Buren. Van Buren and Johnson are voted out of office. What Peter Pitchlynn does is he goes to DC and he convinces the Secretary of War, who oversaw Indian affairs, to fire the old Choctaw Academy superintendent and make him superintendent of the academy. So Peter Pitchlynn is actually installed as the new superintendent in 1841. And he says, my whole mission here is to get the Choctaws out of here. So over the next 2 years, he disenrolls all Choctaw students and takes them back to Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory. And he eventually kind of inspires other tribes to do the same. And some of them even contract with him to get him to bring the students home because he's such an effective mediator. And again, he has a lot of kind of cachet with certain federal officials. Congress actually did undertake a couple of investigations of financial mismanagement at Choctaw Academy. But it's not really until Peter Pitchlynn takes over as superintendent that you get a view of how bad it is. So one of the things that Peter Pitchlynn does is he gets access to all the records of the academy. And that's why so many of those records are today in the Peter Pitchlynn papers in the 2 collections in Oklahoma. But anyway, what he finds out is that Richard Mentor Johnson and his cronies are skimming at least $10,000 a year off of the tuition money. And in today's money, that's more like $300,000 a year. So it's really steep. Yeah, so I'll leave that there.
Pretty crazy, but pretty on par with what, as you were saying, most people were doing at the time. So much profiting off Indian affairs and the seizure of lands. Yeah. And so that kind of takes us to the next question. So in chapter 6, you talk about removal and its kind of impacts. This also really just seems to be a major turning point in how the school was run, which you touched on a little bit already. So can you talk a little bit more about the before and the after effects on the students while they were there at Choctaw Academy, and how removal itself affected Indian Nation's government's relationship to the school?
Sure. Yeah. So removal is just it's the major turning point really in this story. And obviously it's a change in US Indian policy. So we kind of have a sense of what removal was, right? It was forced relocation to Indian territory. And the previous policy had been known as civilization policy. So the emphasis was more on assimilating Native Americans to white ways so that eventually they would become citizens of the US and give up their tribal land bases. So really what you go from in terms of this policy change is one focused on assimilation to one focused on segregation. So in that kind of space, a lot of people ask, well, what is the goal of Indian education? Both people in the US are asking this and Native nations are asking this. Like, what is the point, right? And in terms of tribal leaders and parents, they're really divided on whether to keep students at Choctaw Academy or not. Because one of the things that you mentioned is that obviously Indian Territory is much farther away from tribal homelands than that they had previously been. So that it's a question of distance. And parents ask, well, should I leave my children at school or should I take them to Indian Territory? And some people just feel like they need their children close during this traumatic time. But others feel like actually removal is often so violent and so dangerous that they would rather have their children at school. So there are no great choices really in this story. There are also turmoil within nations, and even after in Indian Territory, there are people who, from the early days of removal, start thinking about creating their own school systems in Indian Territory. I think that complaints about Choctaw Academy, they really start with Peter Pitchlynn, and then they accelerate after removal. And so people are beginning to think about creating educational alternatives, but life is really hard in Indian Territory in the 1830s, right? So there's high mortality rates from removal itself. There's a drought that we now know was worse than the Dust Bowl. There's cholera, which is a new disease that had been recently introduced to the US. There are also some other diseases that were deadly, like tuberculosis. It was really difficult in that kind of environment to get schools up and running. But I would say that once people are able to adapt and move ahead, they really turn their attention toward enhancing tribal sovereignty. I would say in the 1840s, so by the early 1840s, the Choctaws and several other tribal nations really start the process of building their own school systems. So they're interested in education. They're still interested in it, despite all the problems of Choctaw Academy, but they think we need to be in charge and not the federal government.
Yeah, and that starts to merge together the next two questions. And so thinking about what were some of the factors that led to the closing of Choctaw Academy. Francine says she wants to hear a little bit more about the cholera episode there and maybe about the cemeteries. So could you say something on that?
Sure. So what leads to the closing of Choctaw Academy? There's definitely concerns. I mean, so just to speak about the cholera epidemic for a minute, much like COVID, this was a brand new disease in the US. I think it first came to the US in 1831, and it was really scary. It killed, I think, 9,000 people in New Orleans, 4,000 people in New York City. So it was like had extremely high rates of fatality. Nobody knew how to deal with it. And it strikes Choctaw Academy too. And I do talk about this a little bit in the book. I think off the top of my head, I think there are 14 students who die out of a total enrolled student body of just maybe 130. So it's a pretty high mortality rate. And in terms of, cemeteries at Choctaw Academy, as far as I know, none have been located. There is a cemetery at a nearby Baptist church where some of the students were members of that church. So they may be there, but they're unmarked graves in that churchyard. So anyway, we can talk more about like the contemporary side of Choctaw Academy. But I don't actually know where those students are buried, but they would have been buried at Choctaw Academy, the students who died in the cholera epidemic. So other factors that lead to the closing of the school, obviously the financial concern is huge, right? People are increasingly concerned about the quality of education that students are receiving. And there's also anxiety about separation from family and cultural traditions, right? That initially many families were willing to make this trade-off of education, in terms of allowing their child to move away for several years. But once Johnson starts to try to keep students for years longer than they're supposed to be, there's a concern that they're losing touch with tribal traditions, right? And many families want students to be closer. Some of the really most I would say heartbreaking cases of alumni there are a few people who commit suicide or develop dependency problems because of the hardships that they had faced or that their families had faced during removal. So there's kind of combination of issues.
And so before that, you started to talk about the transition to focusing on schools within Indian Territory, in which Choctaw Nation would have a lot more control over. And that was actually one of my favorite chapter of the book, was about this shift. Can you say a little bit more about this? I know you mentioned Wheelock Academy in there, and I saw Dawn was in attendees and she works there. And so would love to hear if you had a chance to stop by.
Sure, yeah. I really was interested in researching that chapter too. And I did go to Wheelock, so I can talk about that in a second. But in terms of just like once Choctaws had decided to leave Choctaw Academy, so there were no more Choctaws at the academy by 1842. And that was the same year that the Tribal Council passed the Schools Act of 1842. And this was like an incredibly progressive educational movement. So it had, there were basically three different kinds of educational institutions that the Choctaw Nation set up. Weekend schools, and those were for people who worked during the week, including adults. There were neighborhood schools, which were more like 5-day-a-week schools for primary education. And then there were academies, which were the most elite kind of institutions. And that would be more equivalent to like a high school level education. And finally, the Tribal Council set aside some money for a certain amount of Choctaw citizens to go to college in the United States every year. So they kind of had this really ambitious plan to provide free schooling to all Choctaw citizens. And in order to really appreciate how important it is, we should realize that like even in the United States, which was regarded as having a really progressive educational system, there were only 3 states that provided free schooling before the Choctaws did. So those were Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So the schooling is free, the books are free for Choctaw citizens. The only kind of difficulties that some Choctaw citizens had were like getting to the academies. So obviously the Choctaw Nation was big and it could be difficult to find room and board. But I would say that like this also shows like some of it was a really different kind of educational system than Choctaw Academy. And tribal officials had purposely made changes that were going to make this different from Choctaw Academy. So the most important of those were that this would be co-educational. So not just to focus on boys and men, but there are actually roughly equal numbers of boys and girls that were enrolled in these school systems. Also not just for elite children, this was in theory, open to all tribal citizens, including adults. And finally, that there was some accommodation for bilingual learners. So it wasn't English only education. There was some bilingual instruction, especially in the lower grades. So it's a fascinating period in Native educational history. And basically that school system lasts from 1842 until the takeover by the federal government after the Curtis Act around 1900. So again, these are schools that are controlled by the tribal council. Most of the teachers were Native. So there's just a lot more autonomy. And there were other nations in Indian Territory that had similar kind of educational initiatives. Like the Cherokees, for example, had passed a Schools Act 1 year before the Choctaws. But because of the kind of turmoil in Cherokee Nation after removal, the Choctaws actually got their system off the ground first. So they were kind of the first and also the largest system. So when the federal government seized their schools, there were about 1,000 tribally controlled schools in Indian Territory, and of that 1,000, the Choctaws had 176. So it's a very big educational system. So Megan mentioned Wheelock, and one of the things that I did do during the course of my research was go to Wheelock, which is now owned by Choctaw Nation and is an interpretive center. And Wheelock is a really interesting place because it was established right after removal in the early 1830s, initially as a mission school for girls. And then after the Choctaw Schools Act of 1842, it becomes part of that nationwide system. And then again, around 1900, when it's taken over by the BIA, it becomes a boarding school. So it has this kind of layered history. It goes from being a mission school to a tribally controlled school to being a BIA school. And now, of course, it's a tribally controlled interpretive center. And I think that, so when I went there, I got to meet a couple of Choctaw Nation employees. So Wanda Howard was there, and Stony Trusty, and Thomas Williston, who was very kind and gave me a book about Wheelock. And so they helped me understand this kind of layered history and also the complicated feelings that Choctaws have about that educational past. So yeah, I loved learning more about Wheelock and also seeing the site itself and the documentary that was made about the students who went there.
Yeah, as an immediate follow-up, Ian Thompson, who's the Senior Director of Historic Preservation, he wants to know, have you ever heard of there being instruction in Choctaw language in the early days of Wheelock?
In the early days of Wheelock, I would have to look. So I will email Ian later. I do have a little notes database that I look in, but I will say, like, as a general response to his question, that so Wheelock is one of those schools that becomes an academy. So it's kind of like the highest tier school in the Choctaw Nation after the nation takes it over. And so those were often the schools that really encourage English language training the most. But I will say that even if the school had an official policy of like English only instruction, that teachers did not always follow that. So if you go back and look at like teachers' correspondence, they they will talk about how they're actually speaking Choctaw in the classroom. So again, I'll go back and check, but I would say that I would more than likely there is some Choctaw language instruction in the early days. And even, moving forward, if students needed extra help, it seems like the teachers were willing to accommodate that. And a lot of the teachers are native too.
Yes. Let's see, was there anything else? Questions? Okay. So what are some of the differences and similarities between Choctaw Academy and like later American Indian boarding schools that we've all kind of really heard about, like Carlisle? And so what's that kind of about?
Sure, yeah. So I think, the later boarding schools are the ones that I think are probably the most well known, like you mentioned, Carlisle. And so, yeah, I think that in some ways Choctaw Academy anticipates these, and in some ways it's a real departure. So I'll just start with like the similarities. I mean, I think first the similarities, they're both nominally controlled by the federal government. So first, well, at the time of Choctaw Academy, it's controlled by the War Department, which is where Indian Affairs used to be. Later on, it's the Department of the Interior. There's a lot of interest in assimilation, right? There are also things like military uniforms and an emphasis on discipline. There are even like military style drills, both at Choctaw Academy and at the later academies. In terms of students' experiences, there are also some similarities like homesickness and runaways, some issues dealing with like cultural differences and adjusting to life back home. So, I mean, there's definitely some overlap. In terms of the differences, I would say that the school itself had some policies that were different. So, for example, like one of the reasons that we know that language loss was so devastating at later boarding schools like Carlisle is because they would purposely split up students from tribal groups so they couldn't speak to one another in their own native language. And so Choctaw Academy didn't do that. And in fact, there was a separate dorm for each tribal nation. So there's like a Choctaw dorm and a Cherokee dorm and a Creek dorm and so forth. So students were often just boarding with their tribal members and even with their, brothers or nephews or, cousins, whatever. So family members are staying together. So I don't think there's the same level of language loss, for example. Choctaw Academy also hires a higher proportion of Native teachers. So that's another difference. But I think the most important difference is probably the power of the purse. So the fact that tribal nations are paying for Choctaw Academy gives them a kind of power that they don't have with later boarding schools. So, for example, the money itself gives the nation some say-so over curriculum. Like if tribal leaders didn't like some aspect of the curriculum, they would complain about it, both to the academy, but also to like officials in DC. And it was, those responses were often complied with, right? So the power that money also gives people a certain amount of say-so. And of course, ultimately, the students, the tribal nations do decide to withdraw all students. And that's why Choctaw Academy closes. It's because the tribes decide it's not worth it anymore. So I think that financial investment does give tribal officials a lot of power. And that is something that the federal government realizes about Choctaw Academy and decides not to replicate with later boarding schools like Carlisle. So the resources have a lot to do with it.
Yeah. So what are some things that you as a non-Choctaw researcher have learned in the process of writing about books about Choctaws or just kind of American Indians generally?
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much throughout the course of writing this. And I would say that there are two things that really stand out to me. And one is just the complexities of trying to exercise tribal sovereignty in an increasingly powerful empire. So the US is like really grows from being an East Coast nation when Choctaw Academy opens in the 1820s. And by the time it closes in the 1840s, it's really a transcontinental empire. So like California is the West. And native nations like Choctaws, I was just really, in some ways, it's so devastating to really engage deeply in the history of removal and to see what people went through. And the archival record for everything around Choctaw Academy is really rich because so many people were writing home, and like corresponding back and forth. So I would say the picture that it gives you of the heartbreak and kind of terror of removal is, just really shocking and heartbreaking. But I think at the same time, what really I found inspiring was how Choctaws rebuilt their nation in the wake of removal. So there are so many tribally focused histories that often end with removal, so you don't really get to see what happens to people after the Trail of Tears, right? So one thing that I liked about researching this is that you can actually see that transition for how people deal with the devastation of removal and are able to adapt and survive, and really fight back against a lot of federal policies. So it was really inspiring in that way.
Cool. Sandra wants to know exactly how much time did it take to research the book?
Oh, wow. So it took 7. That's research and writing, So, and historians think that's fast. So for us, yeah, it took a long time. And so I'm a professor. I teach at Penn State. And so part of our job is that we are always teaching courses as well. So, I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship for 2 years out of the time. I guess that's maybe 1.5 years out of the time that I had. So I was able to, travel all around the country to archives and speak to people and so forth. But for a lot of the time of this book, I was also teaching at the same time. And honestly, when I first started researching this, I thought it was going to be like a pretty focused topic. I was like, it's one school and it's like 23 years, and I could probably do this in a relatively short period of time. And then that was like so wrong. It was, and I'm glad that I was wrong though, because just the records were so rich, and if you look at things like Peter Pitchland collection, it's like thousands of documents. And yeah, you have to really fully capture the complexity of people who were in this moment and the decisions they were trying to make. And I also decided that I wanted to kind of see what happened to alumni of the Academy. What did they do with their education? How did they think about it? And so forth. So I did kind of follow certain people in their postgraduate lives, and that took some space.
Yeah, it's super overwhelming to go through the Choctaw Nation archives. And I think someone told me that one of the archivists at the Oklahoma Historical Society says like most of those written Indian documents are Choctaw ones because as a product of the education being so emphasized and so people were constantly learning and publishing and writing and doing it in so many kinds of venues that we there's so much there. And I think for most other like people who do research on other nations, they don't have this much kind of documentation to go through, and so it's like very difficult in a different kind of way than it is to write other kinds of Indigenous histories.
Yeah, it is really rare to have so many Native authored documents from a 19th century story, especially early in the 19th century. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a real testament to Choctaw people's emphasis on education. And the cool thing is like now, like there's so many rich topics for young scholars to be able to take on.
Yeah, and there's so many Choctaw language documents also. And so I was also kind of wondering, did you kind of try and work with those in any way? Or, yeah.
Yeah, good question. So there are quite a few Choctaw language documents, especially at the Gilcrease. And so I did, There were some like more like minor linguistic issues that I asked a colleague to help me out with. This was Sean Gant, who was a postdoc at Indiana University when I was there. Um, so he's an Eastern Band descendant, Mississippi Choctaw, and knows the language. But I didn't really try to translate the Choctaw language documents at the Gilcrease, you know. I am part of a working group now that is starting to translate some of the Choctaw court cases from the later in the 19th century. Um, and so I'm learning myself, you know. I don't have any proficiency, but part of what I can provide to the group of linguists is the historical background, you know. So I'm interested in it. It's not something that I did, but if there are Choctaw language learners or scholars out there, I can tell you that there are a lot of documents in Choctaw, those Gilcrease papers. And one of the really interesting things that I found there was rural communities within the Choctaw Nation petitioning for schools in the 1840s and 1850s. So they're writing to the tribal council saying, we really want a neighborhood school where we are.
Yes, so much going on. So hard to keep track of everything. Let's see. And so I've also heard that you've been involved with restoration for like kind of the remaining structures of Choctaw Academy in Kentucky. So is there stuff that you can tell us about its current condition and those kinds of efforts?
Sure, yeah. So Dr. Ian Thompson, who you mentioned before, um, has been involved with this education too. And so Choctaw Historic Preservation Department and also the Choctaw Foundation. Um, and so basically the first Choctaw Academy school site, which was built in 1825, there's still one structure that's remaining, and it's a 3-story structure that's built out of local stone, and it was used as kind of a mixed-use dorm and classroom space. It is privately owned by a local ophthalmologist. So he acquired the property like 6 years ago. The owner before him was not very interested in having the property preserved, but this new owner, Chip Richardson, has been very active. And if you're interested in kind of learning more about his group, he's got a Facebook page called Save the Choctaw Academy. And so between Dr. Richardson and various Choctaw Nation foundations, there has been a structure that's helping to preserve the roof, which is caving in. Ultimately, it would be really exciting, I think, to have that as kind of an interpretive site, because it's the largest and most important Indigenous boarding school in the antebellum period, you know, and it really showcases a kind of unique aspect of that history. The only other building that remains on that site is a smaller stone building, which is probably one of the places where enslaved people lived. And again, they worked and did a lot of the day-to-day duties at the school. One of your group members also asked about other sites of Choctaw Academy. So the school itself got so big, and there were some problems with the original site that it did move in the 1830s a couple miles away to a different site, and that site has been totally destroyed. So I don't know if anybody has done any kind of archaeology there, but that would be the only, you know, kind of material culture remaining from that site. So in terms of like a building, you know, the only one that's still there is that original one, which is in a community called Great Crossing, which comes from, you know, the same as the book title. And it's really close to Lexington, Kentucky. So if tribal members or other community members are interested, you can check out the Save the Choctaw Academy page. Certainly there needs to be, I think, a broad coalition if this building is going to get saved and turned into any kind of interpretive site. And I should mention one other thing is that in terms of thinking about the future for this site, there are some, for example, like paintings and pictures that were in the original Academy buildings that are now owned either by private collectors or by the Kentucky Historical Society. So there are other kinds of material culture that survive as well.
All right, perfect. So that kind of gets us through all the prepared questions. And so now I'm going to go through the questions that I didn't already ask.
Great.
So Paula asked about talking about the wealth of Choctaw nations. And I think she asked this question when you were talking about the post-removal and how it was like, it seemed kind of very wealthy. And she was wondering if you could talk about that, or like, I guess the intricacies of governance and the money that kind of comes with that, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of like the wealth of the Choctaw Nation, I mean, I do think that a lot of resources were stolen during removal. You know, either people were never compensated for their houses and cattle and things like that that were taken with removal. So I do think overall, a lot of you know, the more wealthy and privileged students are coming from the old Choctaw Nation before removal, and some of that is lost, you know, during removal. And in terms of the tuition money itself, that's coming from the Choctaw annuity. So that's money that's like set aside in treaties, you know. In terms of personal wealth, I mean, there are Choctaw families who, some people invest more in slaveholding, for example. And some people even sell off certain assets before removal because enslaved people are really the only form of, you know, in the words of the American government, movable property that people can take with them. So there are some people who establish plantations after removal. You know, Robert M. Jones is probably the most famous example of this. He has, I think, ultimately 6 plantations. He also has steamboat and trading stores. I mean, so some people, you know, are not like, they really start to build up a lot of capital. I would say, especially after 1840, when people are kind of able to reestablish themselves in Indian Territory. And people's wealth at that time in Indian Territory, those who could, you know, manage to accumulate wealth, that is mostly coming from cotton plantations or people who are running cattle down to like selling cattle to New Orleans and other kind of big cities. So cattle ranching and cotton plantations.
And then Ian also asked, is there a direct connection between Choctaw Academy and the Treaty of Dokstand, which I think is 1821?
Yeah, there is not actually. So the more direct connection is the Treaty of 1825, which is it's actually negotiated in the aftermath of Dokstand because like for people who are kind of really into the details of treaty history, I'm pretty sure that Dokstand is the one that where the Choctaw Nation sells off a portion of its Mississippi homeland to get territory in Arkansas, but there are already settlers in the Arkansas territory, so they have to negotiate again. So that's where the 1825 treaty comes in. So it's really money that's coming directly out of that 1825 treaty that's made to like renegotiate the Dokstand land transfers.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's all the questions that I've got gone through. So if anyone wants to throw something in, go ahead. Sandra wanted to say that her mother was at Wheelock in the 1920s and they were taught to count in Choctaw and the Lord's Prayer.
There you go. So Ian's question is answered.
Francine, who was on our research group team, who actually was the one who asked the question about the second site of the Choctaw Academy. She mentions that she has a handed down from Thompson McKinney, 3 Shakespeare volumes, which were signed by him in 1854.
Wow, that is awesome.
Yes, Francine has quite the archive in her house. She has so many things. She's a historian in her own right.
Wow, Francine, let's get in touch. Next time I come to Oklahoma, let's have coffee or something.
Yes.
There's also, if people are kind of like Alfred Wade's arithmetic workbook is at the Oklahoma Historical Society, Choctaw Academy, and he has doodles and stuff in it. So it's not just math, it's got some interesting stuff in there.
Yes. It's so funny because when you come across things in the archive, you find certain things that you just like love more than everything else. And I
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of got that sense when I was reading the book and the way that you talked about it.
That was it. I mean, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think I was so delighted because it's just like, so you get this book and it's like long division, and you're like, oh, long division. That's impressive, but you know. And then he has all these great doodles of like his friends, and I just found it really touching.
Yeah. And she has if you guys have the book, she has a picture of it. Let's see if I can pull it up. If anyone has the last chance to get your questions in. Oh, yes, here. So here is her picture in the book from Alfred Wade's arithmetic book. Okay. Francine says she would love to meet and speak with you. Quarantining.
Yay!
Yes. Okay. So I guess that's kind of all that we really have. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I just want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity, and it was a pleasure to talk with you, Megan, and also I appreciate everyone's questions.
Yes. Okay. And so Jennifer suggested that I tell you a little bit. So Christina mentioned the Gilcrease and how that's where she did a lot of her research with the Peter Pitchlynn collection, which the Gilcrease says that is like one of their biggest collections. And so that's something that some of us in the research group for historic preservation, we took a trip to the Gilcrease to kind of like go through all of the material. So we took a lot of pictures of the documents and we are processing them still. But there's definitely, we're trying to try and see if there's a way to kind of digitize them. And Diana Folsom at the Gilcrease, she's also Choctaw. We all knew that the moment she said her name, Folsom, we're like, oh, Choctaw. But that's kind of one of our projects that we are working on in historic preservation. But yes. And so I guess that kind of really concludes this session. So I really want to extend a very heartfelt yakoki to Dr. Snyder for her work on Choctaw Academy and for joining us virtually today. I've learned so much from her book, and I hope we were able to kind of give everyone who hasn't read the book a kind of good snapshot of it. So thank you for tuning in and watching. If you want to stay updated on the Chata Tasholi virtual speaker series, I'm going to post a link to where you can input your information, and so you can get updated about that. You can also just email me, meganb@choctawnation.com, if you want to let me know that you want to be added to the listserv. So be on the lookout. We are trying to have another speaker event towards the end of the month, so just wait and see about that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.